just had no political party whatsoever. And this sort of spelt a terrain of anarchy, right? Desertion, betrayal, treachery. I mean, these, I'm afraid, happen under political parties. But when there's no party discipline.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. John Robertson is one of the forgotten architects of Australian liberalism, a radical Democrat, a relentless reformer, and 5 times Premier of New South Wales. Robertson's political career spanned almost 3 decades and left a profound mark on Australian political history. Yet, despite all that, he has never been the subject of a full-length biography. He was born in London's industrial East End, but raised in colonial New South Wales. John Robertson came to embody the Australian ideal of social mobility. He was a staunch believer in liberty, in property and parliamentary democracy. He led the charge for manhood suffrage, the secret ballot, and most famously, of course, the Robertson Land Acts of 1861. And these placed property ownership at the heart of a liberal society in Australia. And this was decades before Robert Menzies would do the same with home ownership in the 50s and 60s. Joining me today to resurrect John Robertson is William Coleman, adjunct professor at the University of Notre Dame. Welcome, William.
Thank you, Georgina. Great pleasure.
It's a great pleasure to have you on, and your second appearance on Afternoon Light.
Yes, indeed, it is.
It's wonderful to have a repeat. We have a few in that storied category, so congratulations.
Glad to join them.
So, John Robertson, I guess for people in New South Wales a bit more familiar than for people outside of New South Wales, but he really isn't as familiar a figure as he perhaps should be. Why should Australians know about John Robertson, William?
Well, firstly, he was the most successful politician in the second half of the 19th century in Australia, across all 6 colonies. He was also one of the politicians who, in the middle of that century, transformed Australia from an oligarchical polity into a recognisably modern-style democracy. Thirdly, his land acts were certainly important in creating freehold in New South Wales, and I thought that was a very lovely and valid analogy between the post-World War II Liberals emphasising home ownership and the late 19th century Liberals emphasising, if you like, homestead ownership. And his acts were a great stimulus to similar acts, which were passed in Victoria, another act in South Australia, something again in Queensland. There's another quite different reason why I think he should be recalled, at least recognised, because he was representative of a strand of 19th century liberalism which for at least 2 generations languished in the 20th century. This strand was staunchly free trade and yet Australianist. Now, with the advent of federation, both those things went out. Of course, it's well known that part of the Australian settlement, so-called, really the Federation settlement, was the end of free trade in Australia. But perhaps a bit more paradoxically, federation was also a cue for a kind of Britannicism amongst Liberals in Australia, which Robertson was never part of. He was always, if you like, Australianist. And I think that Britannicism, though it was part of the times, wasn't entirely a good thing for liberalism in Australia.
Where would he have sat then, William, in relation to, say, the Australian Natives Association? Would he have been a subscriber to their views?
The Australian Natives Association, he nominally could not join because he was born in London, of course.
Yes.
And he came out at the age of 4. I think they gave you a kind of honorary membership. But
mainly having been Australian, but just the critical birthplace.
But I think overall his sympathies would have been with he had a kind of Australian Natives Association outlook on those questions. That's right.
Yeah. Can you paint a picture of how the colonial governments treated land ownership? Because I think this is fundamental to any understanding of John Robertson. Mm-hmm. And that sort of idea that the British arrived in Australia and it was terra nullius, and then, had all this land. What were we going to do with it? What happened?
Well, I think the starting point is an act of the British Parliament in 1787, which annexed to the Crown virtually the entirety of Eastern Australia. So henceforth, in British law, That was Crown land. It was owned by the Crown, if you like, Her Majesty in some sense. Now, it could then be alienated, to use the jargon. The early governors might give a few hundred acres here and there to their pals. A little bit later, they began to sell it and auction it. But when the Eastern Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania and South Australia obtained self-government in 1856, 97% of land remained Crown land. A small portion of that would have been leased, but only 3% of it was actual freehold. So this was a problem, in my interpretation, and I believe it's the right interpretation, that Robertson was grasping with. He said quite plainly, you quote him, "It's not the way it should be for the government to own 97% of the land. The people are entitled to that land." And thus his Robertson Land Acts were an attempt to stimulate the spread of freehold in Australia.
It's interesting, the sort of rise of the squatter, who becomes the kind of Australian aristocracy, don't they? The squattocracy.
Yes.
How did they evolve in that time, William?
They evolved beginning in really the 1820s or the 1830s. They were literally, in the beginning, simply squatting, if you like, illegally, right?
On Crown land?
On Crown land.
Because it was all Crown land.
It was all Crown land. Yeah. Then they were given licenses, or sometimes called leases, right? They didn't own it, right? But they were now legally using the land to the exclusion of others.
And that was a pragmatic solution the colonial governments found, I presume, that they just, these squatters were out there. We need to sort of organise this a bit better.
You had to bring some law to the situation, right? Otherwise, it was literally lawless. You can imagine fighting amongst themselves and so on. So let's just give them licenses or leases. Now, that might seem sensible, but the Scotters weren't satisfied. They wanted freehold, or at least they wanted leases so long that it was indistinguishable from freehold.
Yeah. And then there was the rise of the selection.
Yes, that's right. These were acts which were passed in New South Wales and Victoria in the early 1860s, which entitled anybody to select up to, it was generally 320 acres of Crown land, be it leased or unleased. And upon the deposit of 5 shillings an acre, they could work it and live in it as if it was their own. And upon the payment of a further 15 shillings, it would be their own, outright, with unimpeachable freehold title. That was the key provision of these Land Acts.
So this gives you an idea then of the importance of what Robertson was doing. Tell me, he starts off life, he's obviously not Australian born in the East End of London. I mean, what was his upbringing like and what brought him to Australia?
Yes. His father was a clockmaker, a skilled craftsman. His mother was the daughter of another skilled craftsman. So they weren't sort of slum dwellers. They were sort of the aristocracy of that industrial portion of London. And it's evident that his father had a patron in the man who became Governor Brisbane of New South Wales. He was a passionate astronomer. So when Brisbane was sent out to New South Wales in 1821, he essentially brought James Robertson, John's father, and his family out with him. So he had somebody handy to help him with his astronomy, because obviously astronomy is highly dependent on clocks and clock keeping. So that's how it is that the Robertsons arrived in Sydney in 1821. Of course, it was a very peculiar society, as in Sydney at that time. About 50%, almost bang on 50% of adults that time were in bond, that is to say, were convicts. And they were almost entirely assigned, which means they were assigned to settlers, and many of them were servants in households throughout Sydney. So Robertson would have grown up in a kind of convict household. Now, I find this quite interesting because it's quite clear that the convicts of that period, they might be bond, they were not broken. On the contrary, they every day would give examples of guts, bottle, and devil-may-care. Now, of course, the respectable people of Sydney fretted that all these convict servants would sort of be a corrupting influence on the infants of our land. In fact, the paradox is, it's well established that the children of the first generation of convicts, they're a bit sort of harem-scarum, but they were active, honest, hale citizens. They were the currency lads and lasses. And that's what Robertson was. He was a currency lad. He was a rollicking, frolicking individual, and yet hale, sort of vigorous and wholesome. So I think that upbringing was important. And you also mentioned the aspect of social mobility. It was, of course, a society of extraordinary social mobility, right? You earn 10 cows and a few sheep in 1820, and 15 years later, you're a squatter with vast herds. In a small way, the moderate way, Robertson's family too were part of that mobility because his father received a land grant in the Hunter Valley, and he ended his days in Aberglisson, I think it's known, which is a sort of stately home out in the Hunter Valley, which is still there and you can still look at it. So that was a sort of transformation, wasn't it? I think that was important because Robertson was he wasn't an underdog, right? But neither was he a parvenu. Neither was he to the manner born, right? He avoided all these sort of traps of one's social existence. He didn't have the resentment of the underdog or the insecurity of the parvenu or the assumption of the to the manner born. He was well built, if you like, to move easily amongst all the compartments of layers of the society.
And his father was Scottish, mother English.
Yeah.
Was there a kind of Scottishness about him, or I guess a 19th century Scottishness?
To the end of his days, he had a slight Scottish accent. So there you go. Yes, there was. That's not so unusual. Dorothy McKellar, you can listen to her recorded voice. She wasn't even born in Scotland. She was born in Australia. But there's a Scottishness about her voice.
Oh, really?
There's Scottish vowels there.
Yeah.
So, yes, there was a Scottish aspect. Culturally, he was more Scottish than English. He was sent to school at the school established by the Reverend Dunmore Lang of the Church of Scotland. So it was a very sort of Presbyterian sort of upbringing.
And this sort of, I guess, inculcated in him this value of the individual.
Oh, for sure. That's right, the individualism of the Scottish Enlightenment particularly had soaked through Presbyterianism at that time, for sure. The value of rationality and enlightenment and progress, all these sort of optimistic doctrines of that Enlightenment Presbyterianism had certainly soaked into him. A great, if the words, sympathy, predilection towards the United States, right? Presbyterianism was very sympathetic to what the Americans were doing over there. The United States was always more his model, and that connects up with his, if you like, Australianism. He was always full of conventional expressions of loyalty to Her Majesty, but the United States was more his model than England, I would say, in constitutional questions, definitely.
And by that, do you mean in terms of the conception of individual rights and freedoms?
Certainly individual rights and freedoms. Also the notion of democracy in a sociological sense, like equality, right? No aristocrats, no rule by the better of the inferior.
So as he grows up with these Scottish Enlightenment ideals coming out of, I think it was Caledonian College in Sydney,
that's right.
The one run by Lang, how does he enter the Australian political sphere or the New South Wales colonial political sphere as it was?
Rather diagonally. His first great hope was to be a squatter, right? So at a very young age, he threw himself into this great spilling across the tablelands and slopes and plains of Eastern Australia in the 1830s. He roved about those plains and tablelands seeking land. He found 20,000 acres south of the Namoy River.
And where's that? Where's the
Namoy River is a tributary of the Darling.
Right.
And it was, in fact, economically worthless land, right? He didn't realise that. He only realised it when reality broke in the crisis of 1844. He forfeited his lease and he was bankrupted. So his dreams, his youthful dreams, right, came crashing down. And
sorry to butt in, William, what was the consequence of being bankrupted in sort of the, I guess, early 19th century in Australia?
Well, it wasn't as bad as 18th century England. They had reformed the law. You weren't sent to prison anymore. But I guess in broader sense, it's not so different than it is today. They audited you to see what assets you had, and they were dished out amongst creditors. So it was broadly the same. He was only in a state of bankruptcy for a year. In that sense, it was relatively modern law by this time. You paid what you could and then you were let go. But, I mean, psychologically, it would have been a harsh end to those youthful dreams. So he retreated to the Hunter Valley, more as now as a small agriculturalist. The Hunter Valley was dominated by big families, the Dumaresques, the Dangars, the Scots. He wasn't of that level. He was a small agriculturalist. And I think it was probably in that period that his mind was now turned to politics.
Yeah, and was he, through the bankruptcy experience and his aspiration to be a squatter that obviously failed, did he have political concerns that were, the system was unfair or that he needed to change the way colonial New South Wales was governed?
I think there is a transition from more concrete problems to more abstract problems. So what is literally his first causes in public life were sort of protests, like the civil servants had decided squatters couldn't go X to X, and he would successfully protested that to Governor Gibbs. Or later he had a cause about dingoes, because dingoes were making necessary the employment of shepherds, and shepherds were just terribly expensive and labour was terribly short. So it's concrete problems. But I believe in the Hunter Valley he came in contact with the animated intelligentsia of that period. The Hunter Valley was it was more respectable Englishmen, it was more educated. And I think that intelligence had a consciousness raising effect on him and just raised his sights. Well, perhaps indeed I could, there are bigger issues and bigger solutions to these problems.
And so he had a concern around the structure of the New South Wales constitution and parliament.
Yes.
I mean, this was sort of his, first foray into serious colonial politics, wasn't it?
That's right. At this time in the 1840s, the British Parliament had passed, I think it's called the Australian Constitution Act, which gave the colonies the rights to write their own constitutions broadly. It immediately became a war in New South Wales between those who wanted a kind of conservative Wentworthian sort of constitution with a powerful unelected legislative council and those who wanted a more democratic constitution. On the democratic side were people like Parkes and also Robertson. So that was really the beginning of his more formal political activity.
And through that, you see the inspiration he's taking from the United States Constitution?
Oh, I believe so. It's definitely with respect to the Legislative Council, which was simply a kind of class thing, if you like, right? Certainly the betters, right, were to rule the not-so-goods, and he completely rejected that on an American-style sense of equality, yes.
Because I think one of the miracles of Australian democracy is that we saw what had happened in America and the revolution that took place to kick out the British.
Yeah.
And we saw a way of, giving, the British, of course, giving us self-government and these colonial governments with proper powers to govern the subjects rather than that sort of anti-democratic rule from afar and actually, the people are not consenting to this and we'll rise up and revolt. So there was a lesson learned in Australia from what had happened in the United States.
Well, I think the lesson was learned by the British, really.
Yeah.
The British gave self-government of a sort to New Brunswick and to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, I think, in 1783. It's even before the Americans were formally independent. The British knew that you had to give some degree of self-government to these colonies. The problem with New South Wales were convicts, right? You can't let convicts run a government, can you? This was the great stumbling block. And that's why self-government came to Australia, I think, relatively late. If there wasn't the convict issue, it would have come before, and it should have come before anyway. But that was something which the British had to get over. And that was probably why they were semi-sympathetic to Wentworthian notions of rule by the betters, right, of the not-so-goods. But that was inconsistent with the reality of Australian society.
Yeah.
And so while Wentworth had his way and the original constitution in New South Wales did have this legislative council, its presumptions were not to last long.
No.
No.
I mean, Robertson himself was not in favour of bicameral
No,
parliament.
Robertson favoured a single chamber parliament, which I have to say I emphatically disagree with. That was his preference, but if there were to be two chambers, they should both be elected. That was his policy.
And so he becomes Premier for the first time, I believe, on the 9th of March 1960. I mean, what's his journey to the premiership?
His journey to the premiership is it comes self-governed in 1856. The colonial elite, right, of a sort of Wentworthian inspiration, think, now our moment has arrived. The Colonial Office is now out of the picture, right? Their agents in Australia, well, they no longer have their patrons, right? Now is our hour. This is epitomised by, say, James Martin. Now, the Liberals in New South Wales said, hang on, not so fast. These sort of Wentworthian types, they were not going to rule New South Wales. So that was how Robertson first actively entered politics as a member of Parliament in this struggle between these Wentworthian conservatives and more liberal types.
Yeah, and so then with the support of people like Charles Cowper, he becomes Premier, and this is sort of really the start of 30 years of liberalism.
Yes, that's right.
Ruling New South Wales.
30 years of liberal rule up till, well, it's a bit hard to say, the 1890s. We had protectionist governments with the rise of the Labor Party. The political complexion changed. But for about 30 years, we had just one political philosophy ruling, a sort of liberal political philosophy. That's right.
So, I mean, we're of course, the inheritors of that legacy to this day. What were the key features of this 30 years? I mean, Robertson himself was in Parliament for 26, I think it was.
Well, more like 30. His premierships extended over a 26-year span.
Yeah.
Firstly, free trade. Secondly, free selection. Thirdly, no funding of churches. Remember, all the churches were funded, right? There would be no funding of churches. Fourthly, and this is also important, and not a policy I agree with, by the way, but no funding of non-government schools, right? That was their fourth platform. Now, we could talk about this at greater length, but Robertson believed in a kind of general school system which would be representative of all and which would therefore please all. That was his hope. But, yeah.
So can we explore these four principles that really sort of guided this period of liberal rule? I mean, free trade, was Robertson's ideas linked to the economic value of that, or was it more to do with his sort of sense that you should be the decision maker of your own goods and services and not be impeded by something else, rules, regulations, other people's concerns?
It was both. He had every respect for the contribution which free trade would make to wealth, but he also was very conscious and receptive of the notion that you have a right to use as you please the fruits of your own labour. If you want to trade them, that use those fruits to trade with X, you have a right to do that. If Y, you have a right to do that. So it was both, if you like, an instrumental justification in terms of wealth, but also a rights justification. Yes.
And was there much challenge in New South Wales to that? Obviously, there were different views in different colonies, the Victorians being famously protectionist.
After a period. Yes, there was, because people like James Martin, having sort of lost on the Land Acts and so on, thought, protection is my way back in, right? This will be a sectional appeal, an appeal to a population which, namely manufacturing working people, who I previously haven't appealed very much, but this will be my in with them. So yes, there was the 1864 general election in New South Wales, which was really fought on protection, and Robertson won that quite soundly. So one shouldn't say that free trade was sort of hegemonic. It was policy, but without being hegemonic.
And then you talk about free selection.
Yes.
I mean, what was the basis for free selection?
Free selection is essentially the principle of being able to select the 320 acres, which I mentioned before, but with an important twist. The land did not have to be first surveyed. That is to say, marks on trees did not have to be cut out to precisely delineate the borders of the land on a map, so to speak. This was very important. Firstly, because of the practical reason that sort of survey took years, but also because of corruption. If you didn't want Tom to select 320 acres on your pal's lease, you would just delay the survey until he got so tired of it, Tom went elsewhere. So it was taking that potential tool of corruption out of the hands of possibly corrupt civil servants.
And did that have the desired effects?
Oh, I think it did. I think the amount of freehold in New South Wales went from 7 million acres to 35 million acres. You could say 53 million acres on some measures in the 50 years after the Acts. So, yes, I did think in that, with respect to that purpose, yes, the Acts did have their effect.
And Robertson, did he see the importance of these reforms as fundamental to the economic development of New South Wales, that by people having property rights, they invested in the development of that property, be it through, sheep, running sheep?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Robertson was against the idea of simply an unconditional right to occupy. He really felt you had to work the land if you had any right to that land.
So this idea, I think it was peacocking, wasn't it, where you just sort of go and, choose a nice little bit of the water source or something
that's right.
in a squatter's run and sort of really cruel their chances of making it.
And hope to be bought out.
Yeah.
Well, Robertson would say crack down on that. But yes, that was not his intention, of course. The law required you to live on the land, to work it and to improve it. So that would be an abuse. That's how you'd classify that behaviour.
Yeah. Now, on education, this sort of idea that the New South Wales government wouldn't be funding non-government schools.
Yes.
So there was a sense that if you wanted to set up, say, a church school, Catholic, Church of England, Presbyterian, then that was your own affair, your community's affair.
Yeah.
And these government schools would just be, I guess, secular. Was that the
No,
impression?
I think
or
this was not Robertson's ambition at all.
Or were they just denominationally
I prefer
Christian?
to say they were ecumenical. Right?
Yes.
The idea was on the basis of island school system, where they had brought together Catholics, of course the majority of the population of Ireland, the Church of Ireland and the Presbyterians of Ireland. They had brought them together, right? And they had contrived textbooks which all three denominations could agree upon. These were known as Irish national readers. This was be to the basis of these government schools, which would be the only schools which would be funded. In Robertson's vision, they were carefully ecumenical. So they were not to be secular, right?
And so Robertson's policy around this was to do with maintaining social cohesion in a religiously pluralistic society?
I suspect so, yes. I suspect it. He was quite impartial with respect to sectarian divides. He was carefully impartial. So it wasn't out of, say, an anti-Catholic animus that Catholic schools would be funded. Not for Robertson. I firmly believe that. It was more a positive belief in a kind of cohesion of benefit of these sort of carefully ecumenical schools which he envisaged.
But when it came to immigration from, say, non-Anglo countries, Anglo-Irish countries, so say the Chinese immigration, he was less of a liberal, wasn't he?
Absolutely, as indeed almost everybody was, except for you could count on your hands of the people who were not in favour of some sort of anti-Chinese legislation. Incidentally, the Cole's Funny Picture Book man, he was one of those rare breeds, right, who was very much against this anti-Chinese legislation. But otherwise, it was an almost hegemonic policy. What I would say, if you like, and to do justice to Robertson on this issue, was that he was much less in favour of this anti-Chinese legislation than was, say, most people, than was, say, Parkes, okay? So I think there's some exoneration of Robertson in his relative lack of enthusiasm for these laws.
Yeah. So can you describe for me Robertson's, I guess, politics of camaraderie that you see evident in the 19th century?
But what we have to realise is that political parties did not exist.
Yeah.
Unlike in the United States, which by the 1860s had certainly developed them, or England, which had certainly developed them, you just had no political party whatsoever. And this sort of spelt a terrain of anarchy, right? Desertion, betrayal, treachery. I mean, these, I'm afraid, happen under political parties. But when there's no party discipline, right, there's no, hey, you're never going to eat lunch in this party ever again type threat, you have a real problem. There are two sort of solutions to try and bringing discipline. In the absence of party discipline, bringing order. The first I'd call the politics of following, right? This is simply the chief in Indians, right? Yeah. And psychologically, you have a chief, you have the big chief, and you have the Indians, right? You just invest in the chief authority. It's sort of simple, we're all aware of that. And that's really epitomised by Henry Parkes. He was the big chief and he had just his Indians. They were quite devoted to him sometimes, but it was very much a one-way thing. The politics of camaraderie, or the politics of the circle, as I prefer to call it, was much more where there's a circle of people, where there's much more characteristic of equality. If you like, it's much more friend-like, because equality is a defining characteristic of friendship, or any true healthy friendship. So you had this group of friends who, by the nature of friendship, could strike bargains and deals with them, which there would be some good faith, and which would therefore be emancipated from the ever-present threat of treachery, betrayal, and deceit. So this circle of friends were a resource to construct an order within the Parliament. And he did so with some success. I'm not saying it was his only technique, but it was an technique. So the Sydney Morning Herald would describe a Robertson premiership as Sir John Robertson and his friends.
Yeah, that was the party, so to speak.
Yeah.
How did that go at an election then? I mean, would candidates run as a friend of John Robertson, or I'm part of the circle, or you know?
Yes.
I mean, how did people know? Was the politics so kind of intimate because the population was so small that people knew they were a follower of Robertson or not? Or...
Yes, they would advertise themselves as one of Jack's pals, absolutely, for sure. So at election time, you would certainly announce who you were in league with, for sure, and everybody understood this, yeah.
Did this, I guess, politics of the circle, did it give more power then to the Parliament than we perhaps see today, where the executive is really, the sort of critical locus of power?
Well, that's the flip side of the being the absence of parties, was you had a power of Parliament, right? So Parliament was a ruling force in itself, distinct from the executive, from the government. Parliament was the locus decision. On the floor of the chamber, it would be decided where a hospital would be built or where a railway would be built, because so much power had not been delegated to civil servants, the courts, and above all, the executive.
What about the idea of an opposition then in this Parliament of, friends and circles of friends?
Well, I don't mean to over-sentimentalise it. No. Friends, one of the points of friendship is you can disagree with a friend, right? And so they weren't just a block of voters. They would disagree with one another and vote on different sides on issues. So let's not sort of sentimentalise it, but as I say, it was some resource of trust and good faith when deals were made. But yes, the British inheritance was so powerful that there was a leader of the opposition, but it was not formally recognised, right? And you would sometimes have two people claiming to be leaders of the opposition. And this happened several times with Robertson and Parkes. Robertson would claim to be leader of the Liberal opposition in response to, say, a squatter government. Well, Parkes would say, well, actually, I'm the leader of the opposition. So it was a very informal and shadowy office, leader of the opposition.
How did people vote back then? Do we have a sense of whether they're voting for the individual candidate, or was it on a policy issue? Land. I like Robertson's idea for these land acts, and I'm going to vote for that.
Look, there's no doubt that policy was probably the principal thing. For the voter, it was, I think, instrumental. What are you going to deliver? A politician might be popular or unpopular with a voter, but it was what have you done, what have you delivered was probably the most powerful thing for the voter. Yeah.
So political parties do, of course, evolve in colonial parliaments.
Yes.
I mean, what were they? We know the Labor Party was in the 1890s.
Suddenly appeared in the 1890s in the wake of terrible industrial disputation. Around about the same time, protectionist parties also evolved. And in the very late 1880s, a Free Trade and Liberal Association was founded in Sydney. So, yes, they were coming in without a doubt. But the Labor Party was the party of parties. It sort of set down the model for the other parties as to how you run a party.
And how well organised were these early political parties?
Oh, look, I don't think they were terribly well organised. I think they were pretty shadowy things sometimes. They come and they go and constitutions be drawn up, but I think they were not very strong. Of course, I mentioned the Labor Party was the model, but itself was terribly riven by terrible splits in the 1890s. So it took some while for the, if you like, party patriotism, for party ethos to develop, for sure.
That sort of idea of a political brand. I mean, say, in Australia these days, you think of the Labor Party, the party of the trade union movement. It's, spends big welfare state, big government. The Liberal Party, traditionally would be seen as the party of economic management, fiscal conservatism, balanced budgets, strong defence. Those brands that are attached to parties these days, I mean, they take time to evolve and, people attach attitudes towards a party based on previous experience of the party. How did those brands, so to speak, evolve in that 19th century period with the free traders, the protectionists, and then, of course, the Labor Party?
Well, one way you can try to brand yourself is by the name you use, free trade, right? That's certainly a branding. Labor, I mean, again, that's certainly a very protection. These are all quite, they're not like Republican or Commonwealth, or they're very clear sort of forms of branding. But I think it was a real problem. The number of parties which used the word liberal before the First World War is just legion, right?
Yeah, no one wanted to be a conservative then.
Well, that's true. Oh, no, that was taboo word.
Yeah. So Robertson himself, a free trader, of course, how did he view the rise of these political parties? I guess different from his band of volunteers.
Yes, it was different. Yeah. Look, he wasn't used to it. The world was moving away from him. Parties were coming in and he was sort of going out. So he wasn't a part of it. He was very resentful of them and he was conducting himself quite irascibly at the conferences of them he did attend. He did agree to be the first commemorative, almost president of the Free Trade and Liberal Association. But he stood up at the conference and told them that he hoped nobody donated to the Free Trade and Liberal Association because parties were such a lot of nonsense. So, yes, he belonged to a previous period. Yeah.
So would you say, I mean, this is totally hypothetical, William, and terribly bad historical method, but, what would he think of the rise of independence and the teals today? I mean, he would think that was more authentic politics, how
absolutely.
It used to be done in the 1860s and 70s?
Yeah. I think he thoroughly sympathised with the idea of the independent. Indeed, all the MPs in that period stressed their independence. And, of course, that was the flip side of the lack of party discipline, isn't it? I'm an independent. I make my own mind up. So, yes, of course, he would sympathise with the notion of independence. Yeah.
And he wouldn't have seen value in the party system as, I guess, tidying up the disorganisation of a ragtag group of independents who may agree on one issue but disagree on another. And if you're the government of the day, how do you go back to the people in an accountable way?
Yes, I think that's a good point. I think parties do, if you like, strengthen the covenant between the individual voter and the candidate and possible member of parliament. They're well branded, right? They, relatively speaking, to an independent. I think many of these teals, I wondered what they actually mean to the people who vote for them. So I think parties do have a purpose in improving that covenant between the voter and the elected member. There's no doubt about that. But, of course, parties have violated the covenant with voters themselves many times.
I mean, I think this is a stretch, but I'd be interested in your views. This idea of the independent parliamentarian,
yes,
which was obviously very strong in colonial New South Wales for the rise of the parties in the late 19th century. I mean, you see that the teal movement, for example, is very much a New South Wales or a Sydney movement. Is that something in the political culture of New South Wales that's just stuck over 200 years or 150 years?
Well, what you're raising, Georgina, is this whole issue of legacy. Are things legacical, right?
Yeah.
Do we have historical heritages, or is that just a romantic myth and every generation invents itself in its own way? Look, Sydney has a thing called a harbour, right? Geographically, it just corrugates and splits up and divides. So, for example, the member for Warringah It's called the Insular Peninsula for good reason, right? I think there is an element of Sydney geography which might just make for the fragmentation. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. To finish off, William, I guess a question to, and no doubt to promote the book you've written, the monograph on John Robertson, Liberal of the People. It's published by Connor Court as part of their Australian Biographical Monograph series. Why do you think Robertson's been forgotten?
Well, firstly, Robertson was very much an anti-federationist. He wasn't an opponent in the abstract of a single government for Australia. In fact, it would have been good if we didn't have separation of New South Wales into Van Diemen's Land and Port Phillip and later Victoria and Queensland. It would have been good just to have one. So he was not in the abstract an opponent of a single government. But he felt that these colonies had separated and each inevitably had become their own vested interest. Each had their own debt. Each had their own government railways. Each had their own industries. And so he felt that federation would just become a means of each colony trying to unload their debt on the others, trying to force the others to use their under-patronised railways, trying to force the others to buy their overpriced goods. This was his negative vision of federation. So he was distinctly anti-federation. Now, the upshot of this, if you're writing Australian history, was that he was on the losing side. And, inevitably, perhaps this is not the best history, but inevitably the losing side, well, they're not part of the story. They lost, didn't they?
Yeah.
So I think that is the principal reason why he has been neglected. But as I said, I don't think that's a good enough reason to neglect him, even putting aside his lack of success with respect to federation. I think his role in the democratisation of Australian polities and his role of the Land Acts is certainly enough for him to merit memorialisation.
I think we love to search for fathers of.
Yes.
There should be more mothers of, but let's be honest, they tend to be fathers of.
Yeah.
Fathers of liberalism, which is, it's a unique, distinctive Australian political tradition.
Yeah.
And we're here at the Robert Menzies Institute, as you talk of Robert Menzies as the sort of modern day father of Australian liberalism. But Robertson is surely one of the precursors. He might be a great-grandfather or great-uncle.
Well, I think he does a job much better than, say, Henry Parkes, right, who was much more, shall we say, variable in his adherence to liberal principles. He'd pick them up and throw them aside. I think Henry Parkes was Britannicist in a way which is not sort of helpful in today's politics. He was sectarian, which is certainly not helpful in today's politics. Robertson avoids those traps. I think he's a much more suitable figure to be the grandfather of Australian liberalism, for sure.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on, William. Thank you so much for bringing John Robertson out from the dusty bottom drawer of someone's grandma's, old drawing room, and we can rediscover him and the important contribution he made to the development of this unique Australian political philosophy. So thank you for what you've done.
Thank you, Georgina, for the opportunity.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.